Half a Moon In, Chapter 3. Up the road Aaron marched, with the snow knee-deep on the ground now and still blowing down from the clouds. His feet felt pinched, for he'd outgrown his boots, and the wind numbed his face till it felt like stone. The sound of the sea faded as he tramped along, the sack slung over his shoulder and his mother's coat dragging in the snow. At last he arrived at the edge of the forest, passed in among the trees, and came to a fork in the road. He bore to the right, just as he remembered his mother doing, and sharpened his eyes for any sign of her. Deeper into the woods he walked, the trees leafless and bare, and their tops swaying in the wind. Soon the road divided again, and again he bore right. Hour after hour he trudged through the snow, treading his way through the maze of the woods, stopping to eat when his stomach grew empty, and moving on through the forest again. It was late afternoon when Aaron came to another fork in the road and stopped, looking about in bewilderment. He struggled to find something familiar to seize on, but nothing he saw set his memory in motion. He stared at the sky, at the trees and the road, and realized that riding along in the wagon was different from guiding it. He turned and looked about for the ocean, but it was nowhere in sight. He climbed up a tree and saw only more trees, stretching endlessly to the horizon in every direction. He cursed his memory, but vowed not to turn back. He took note of the wind and the path of the sun, and suddenly felt certain that he ought to bear left, and struck out up the road. The wind swept angrily out of the sky, driving the snow in his face, and moaning two-voiced through the trees. Onward he trudged, the road twisting like an eel and growing ever more narrow, while the branches gesticulated wildly in the wind, as if desperately struggling to be understood. Snow streamed down, filling in the trail of footprints behind him, and slowly the light began to fade. Soon the road tapered down to a trickle, so that Aaron had to search for it anew every few steps. Still he pushed ahead, tired and hungry, groping for the trail among the trees. At last he stopped and could go no farther. He looked all about him, and there was nothing resembling a path to be seen. At once he was certain of just what he feared, that the road no longer lay under his feet. Somewhere it had escaped him under the snow. He'd simply been dodging between trees for the last hour, and now he was lost, with night coming on. Quick as a squirrel, Aaron climbed up a tree and snapped off a few dead, dry branches and kindled a fire. He melted snow in his pot and poured in some barley, rolled a rotten log from its place, and stretched out on the dry ground beneath it. The snow had stopped falling and the wind had died down, and he lay there, staring into the flames, wondering what he would do in the morning. He could always head into the rising sun and eventually get back to sea. But he made up his mind to find his way into Craftsbury, and to get help for his mother there if he'd not found her first. Night had arrived, and he devoured the barley and drank the water he cooked it in. Then he warmed himself by the fire, wrapped himself up in the 2 winter coats, and lay back on the ground. He listened for the sound of wolves approaching, or robbers returning to their lair, but heard nothing but the soft rustle of branches. Slowly the clouds began to break up, revealing behind them the endless heavens and the moon in the west. The night air was chill and edged with ice, and Aaron lay there in the stillness, watching the stars go sleepwalking across the sky, before he slipped at last into sleep. All the next day, Aaron wandered through the woods, guiding his aching feet among boulders and brambles, searching for a road that would take him to Craftsbury. From sunrise to dusk, he trudged through the snow, without a sign of his mother or anyone else. At night he built a fire and cooked himself dinner and slept out under the shivering stars. On the third day of his journey, he tramped until noon and slowly became aware of a strange scent in the air. He sat himself down on a log to rest, sniffed at the breeze, then jumped to his feet. Of course, it was smoke! Smoke from a fire! There had to be someone nearby. He followed the smell as best he could, and suddenly spotted a passage through the trees. Finally, he'd found his way to a road. Perhaps he could reach Craftsbury this very day. He charged through the snow and struck out up the road, the smell of smoke growing stronger with every step. All of a sudden, the scent of food filled the air. Aaron rounded a bend, and there, up ahead, with two wheels sunk in the snow, stood a wagon full of rags and a man cooking beside it. At last he'd found help. The man was squatting, stirring a pot over a fire, with his back turned to Aaron. Burly and dressed as raggedly as a scarecrow, he appeared to be a ragman who'd become stuck in the snow. Aaron was filled with hunger by the smell of the food, and was eagerly making his way up the road when he stepped on a twig. The man's horse raised its ears. The ragman whirled about and aimed a pistol straight at Aaron's heart. "Keep where you be, me suckling cutthroat." The ragman's eyes bulged wide and afraid, moving quickly over Aaron and scanning the trees behind him. "And tell the rest of your band of marauders that I'll be glad to give the lot of 'em free passage to Hades, if they care to come get it." Aaron stood perfectly still, his heart pounding madly, while the ragman nervously eyed the trees again. His gun followed along with his glance. The two of them faced each other in silence for several moments, the ragman's ears alert and his eyes darting about. Then he looked once again at Aaron's frightened appearance, and at last seemed satisfied that the boy was harmless and alone, and cautiously lowered his pistol. "Can't a man be too careful, lad? Not in the woods. More thieves than trees in a place like this. A fearsome bunch of scoundrels they are, and generous with their shot. Command the very bees to stand and deliver their honey." He ran his eyes over the forest once again. "But what might such a one as you be doing here, me boy?" Aaron pulled out the pen and ink from his sack, took off his mittens and rubbed his hands. On a white sheet of paper he wrote, "Have you seen my mother, Mrs. Amelia Patrick, the weaver of Hiftonhead? I can't speak." He stepped forward and handed the note to the ragman, who opened his eyes in utter amazement. "Bless me bats," he muttered. "I can see I judged you wrong, me lad, and that you been well brought up to read and write, and not such a boy as would steal." He tucked his pistol away with an air of apology, and stared at the paper again. "Aye, it's a fine hand you've got, lad, it is indeed. But tell me now, what does it say?" Aaron looked back at the ragman in disbelief. Having spent his life with his mother, and rarely having left the house, Aaron had always assumed that everyone was able to read and write. How could he explain himself if the man couldn't read? Quickly he took out another sheet of paper from his sack, sketched a portrait of his mother as best he could, and next to it the Cathedral of Craftsbury. The ragman watched with the greatest of interest as he drew. Aaron handed him the paper and looked into his eyes, hoping for a spark of recognition. "Aye, lad, you've got talent," said the ragman, gazing down at the drawing. He shook his head admiringly, glanced again at the note, and handed them both back to Aaron. "Handy with a quill you are, that's easy to see, and just as quiet and polite as you please. Aye, I can see you're a boy that's been raised up right, and taught to behave proper before his elders." Quiet? Polite? The man refused to understand that he was unable to speak. "And now forgive me own manners for waiting to ask, but are you hungry, my lad?" Aaron forgot his troubles for the moment and nodded his head. "Well then." The ragman gave the pot another stir, filled up 2 wooden bowls with stew, and the two of them sat by the fire and ate. "Glad for the company, boy. I don't mind telling you. Been marooned here since morning. The ditch over there was filled up with snow, looked just like the road, till we sunk into it clear to the axle." Aaron looked at the wagon, leaning down off the road and into the snow. "Can't seem to get free, between the horse and meself, but maybe you wouldn't mind giving us a hand, and coming along for the ride, if you be going our way." Aaron's ears perked up. Even if he couldn't be sure they were heading toward Craftsbury, anything would be faster than wandering on foot, and they were bound to strike a town soon enough where he could straighten his bearings. Aaron looked up at the ragman and nodded his head, gulped down his food, and hopped to his feet. "Well then," bellowed the ragman, wiping his mouth with his arm, "climb up on the wagon then, and take up the whip, and put it to use when I give out a yell." Aaron scrambled onto the wagon. He watched as the ragman plodded around to its sunken side, took hold between the wheels, and shouted, "Now!" A mighty groan came from the ragman, and suddenly Aaron felt the whole right side of the wagon swing up in the air. Frantically, he snapped the whip. The horse burst forward, the wagon creaked, and at last it jerked ahead onto the road. "Well done, me boy," the ragman called, as he loaded his things into the wagon. "Well done indeed, and me thanks to you, lad. Now it's homeward to Williford, if that be agreeable to you." Aaron had never heard of the place, but he nodded his head just the same. "And with company besides, all the better, me boy." The ragman took hold of the reins, gave them a shake, and they were off down the road.